Well, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today is a very, very, very special episode. We're going to be talking, I have a special guest with me, and we're going to be talking about two conceptions of the God-world relation. One is the simulation hypothesis, and the other is the authorial analogy. And I have with me Dr. James Anderson, one of my favorite thinkers, and his work has largely introduced me to both these topics. Now, someone might be saying, well, the simulation hypothesis is not really a God-world relation idea, but I think it is. And I'll tell you why as we're talking with Dr. Anderson. So without further ado, let's just bring him right in. Dr. Anderson, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, my pleasure. This is fantastic. So your work has been really influential in a lot of my work. So I've many of my research papers here at TEDS have been because you wrote a blog post on something, and I thought, man, that's a great idea. Let me keep going with that. So I really appreciate that, and that is people can find that blog at prognosco.com. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's right.
Okay, and that's Greek for foreknown, right?
Yeah, to foreknow. That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a long story behind it.
Okay. There's a lot of great blog posts there. And before we jump in, I wanted to ask you about your blog philosophy. What is your conception of your blog? Because some of the things in there are just kind of you'll talk about Iron Man dualism, and it's kind of like off the cuff and it's really interesting. But then others are like a massive takedown of a book, and it's like this could have been a journal article. So can you just lay out like what do you think of your blog post? Like what's the philosophy behind that?
I'm flattered that you think that there's a philosophy behind my blog. It's really just a dumping ground for thoughts and arguments that on the one hand, I think are interesting enough to share and to get some feedback on, but are not well formed enough to deserve publication or an attempt at publication. So often they will be answers to questions that I receive. So I get a lot of correspondence, people saying, oh, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And sometimes I'll reply privately, but I think if what I have to say might be of wider utility, then I'll write something up. Partly for selfish reasons, so that I don't have to keep repeating myself.
Right.
For example, the topic that we're about to talk about, the simulation hypothesis, I got a series of emails asking, what did I think about this? How would I respond to it? And that seemed like a good prompting to write something up on it.
Yeah. And I was so excited when I saw that come out because I'd been thinking about it a lot, mostly because I work in campus ministry, and oftentimes when you're evangelizing or when you're discipling one of your students, they'll say, well, couldn't we just be living in a computer simulation? And it comes up again and again. So I read Bostrom's essay, his famous, I think it's 2001 or 2003 essay. And then I saw you post on it. So it was awesome. And you did something differently than I would have, but now I do what you do. So you started thinking about this because people asked you, or had you heard of this before? Were you aware of Bostrom's argument when it first came out?
I was, maybe not immediately, but it got enough buzz that sooner or later you were going to hear about it from some other source. I'm not sure when I first heard about it. Might have been actually through Sam Harris's podcast. I listen to Harris's podcast from time to time, and I don't know if he had Bostrom on or someone else was talking about it, but I think it was that prompted me to go take a look for myself. I've never been all that interested in these simulation hypotheses as serious proposals. I find it hard to take them seriously, and they always seem to be posited by people who are coming from a very naturalistic perspective,
right.
And usually by people who are much more sympathetic to the strong AI thesis that that computers could become conscious and could replicate human thought. Right. And since I don't find that least bit plausible. A lot of these hypotheses I don't find plausible in the first place. But since the Matrix came out, of course, that's become the paradigm for the simulation hypothesis. And it used to be, what if we're being deceived by an evil demon? Right. But poor Descartes has been, nudged out by the Wachowski brothers, or whatever. I forget the name. Now it's the Matrix. So what if we're living in the Matrix?
Yeah. Well, that's a great point. And you mentioned, you brought this point out in your first blog post. I think you've done two. And your first one, you distinguish this from different global skeptical threats, like brain in the vat, like maybe idealism and some of these others. Can you just lay it out for the listeners? Like how is the simulation hypothesis different than brain in a vat or some form of idealism?
Well, I'm not sure it is different in principle than brain in the vat, because the brain in the vat could be a version of the simulation hypothesis. So if the simulation hypothesis is the general idea that our experiences of the world are not veridical, but are in fact simulated by a computer system or some nefarious agent of some sort, then the brain in the vat hypothesis is just one version of it, because the idea is that you think you have a body, you think you're living in the world that appears to you, but in fact you're a brain that's having all its experiences stimulated artificially through electrodes or whatever. But of course, it's the same principle. Your experiences are being simulated so that you are inhabiting a virtual world rather than a real world. So the brain in a vat is really just the precursor of the Matrix hypothesis, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you're right. And so on the popular level, I've noticed, like you said, people will say maybe we're living in the Matrix. Often they don't say computer simulation, but they say Matrix. And this computer programmer, Rizvan Virk, wrote a book called The Simulation Hypothesis, creatively titled. And he goes with that version, that we are a brain in a vat, that there's something outside the simulation, like the Matrix, where Neo is in base reality. But in the more, I don't know, intellectual circles, but more into the academy, more following the pure Bostromian view, it's that we are digital consciousness, that we are literally simulated. And so maybe I'll just set out the three premises. Bostrom says, one, that we'll never be technologically advanced enough to create simulated conscious beings like ourselves, or two, we will reach that level of advancement, but for some reason we don't do it, maybe for moral reasons, like we together collectively humanity says it's morally wrong to do that, and we make laws and we don't do it. Or three, we're most likely living in a computer simulation, because you take the technological advances that we have now and just project that into the future, 10 years, 20, 100 years if you need to. But looking at our trajectory, it seems like if there's no reason for us not to do it, and we're able to do it, then we probably already have done it, and we're currently living in that simulation. Do you think that's a fair assessment or a fair summary of the argument? And if so, which of the premises do we deny?
Right. Yes, that's right. So Bostrom basically lays out these three options and says you got to pick one of these three doors.
Yeah.
Either door one is we never get to the point where we can actually create a simulation that would be so realistic that beings like us could inhabit it and think it's the real world. So that's option one. It's just not technologically feasible or possible. Option two is that the technology does appear, but we're conscientious enough, or we have some sort of inhibiting reason that prevents us from creating such a simulation and populating it. And then option three is that we can do it, and we will do it, and therefore I suppose we have done it, or someone it's not we, but someone like us has done it, and that would have happened. I think the idea is that it would happen recursively, so that you would have a simulation, and then within the simulation, the same principles apply to the simulation within the simulation,
right, all the way down. Yeah,
right, exactly. Sort of Inception style simulations all the way down, or at least there comes a point when there are more simulations than there are of all the worlds that exist. The simulated worlds far outnumber the singular real world or the base reality, and therefore probabilistically we are in one of those simulated worlds rather than the real world.
Yeah. Well, so I like to motivate this sometimes for people who think it's crazy. Yeah, but let's go a little bit further in looking at it. And for anyone who's watched The Office, in The Office, Dwight Schrute plays this game Second Life, and he makes a Second Life of Dwight inside the reality. So all you have to do is imagine that second Dwight making a third Dwight, making a fourth Dwight. And we probably would do that if we were able to. And so Bostrom's reasoning is, yeah, there's probably, way more simulated conscious beings than there are base reality beings like we take ourselves to be. And therefore, just probability wise, you should think of yourself as probably being a digital consciousness instead of one of the lucky base reality conscious beings.
Yeah. I suppose it is plausible to think that if it would happen once, then it would happen because the same rationale for the original simulators creating a simulation would apply then to the simulated beings and so on and so on. And once you kickstart the process, then there's no reason why I suppose you wouldn't have simulations within simulations.
Yeah. So you give a Plantingian answer, which I want to save for the moment, which I think is great. But are we able to just deny premise one by saying, I don't believe in strong AI? I think that Searle's Chinese Room just totally destroys the idea that there can be a simulated consciousness. So then I just affirm one and say we're not living in a computer simulation?
Well, one thing I did in the original blog post, as you know, was to distinguish different conceptions of a simulation. Yeah. And I laid out three basic options. One is the Sims option, where it is just a computer game and it's fictional characters in a computer game, and that one you can write off right away because the characters don't even exist. The second view would be the matrix view, where we exist outside the matrix, but we're plugged into it. So it's just our experiences that are generated, but we exist outside it. And then the third option is the we are completely generated by some computer. So we're basically conscious simulations running on some computer. So we have some physical realization, but this physical realization gives rise to a conscious mind, which has experiences that are of this simulated world. And really, I think, well, I guess Bostrom's proposal or his argument is assuming the third scenario, where there is a computer system within which conscious beings come into existence. That presumably, if you think that consciousness is an emergent property of material things, as many naturalists argue that the mind is just an emergent property or an emergent phenomenon from matter, then that could happen with a computer system as well. You could get a computer that has the right kind of circuitry, the right kind of functional connections, so that it actually gives rise to a mind, a consciousness, a first-person perspective. And to circle back to the question, I think there are pretty compelling philosophical arguments against the metaphysical possibility of that. Not that it's technologically beyond our ken, but that metaphysically you can't get mind and consciousness out of a purely material substrate. One argument would be Searle's Chinese Room argument against functionalism. If a computer is essentially just a machine that is processing symbols, it's purely functional in its connections, basically a Turing machine, then then a machine like that, while it can simulate human reasoning, some kinds of human reasoning, it cannot actually, it doesn't think in the way that a human being does. It doesn't have, as I think Searle puts it, it doesn't have the semantic aspect of thought. It has, it might have the syntactical aspect, but not the semantic aspect. And so it's not really thinking. It's not actually having any mental content. A computer doesn't actually know what it's doing. It's not aware of what it's doing. It doesn't have any intentions. And therefore, it's not, a machine could not give rise to that kind of thought process that we have. I think there's also, in addition to that, the problem of subjectivity, namely that material entities have certain kinds of properties, the sort of properties that scientists measure, like mass and extension and velocity and so forth. And these are very different kinds of properties than the first-person subjective properties that consciousness has. Like the having of experiences, what it's like to experience such and such. Those kind of subjective features are not possessed. It's a complete category error to ascribe those to a material entity. So those are just a couple of reasons why I don't think that this sort of simulation hypothesis gets off the ground, because the scenario that it's positing is metaphysically impossible in the first place.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So even though we're coming to the same conclusion as the first premise, it's for a different reason. It's not because we're not technologically advanced enough or ever will be. It's metaphysically, this is a category error to say that physical things can have immaterial thoughts. There's no aboutness. There's Nagel's what is it like principle. Like there's nothing that it's like for a robot to be. It doesn't have a first-person experience. So yeah, we would. What would you do there? Would you so you're not buying into the argument, you're not denying one of the premises, because if you're affirming one, you would be committing yourself to the idea that you could be technologically advanced enough to make these conscious beings, but we never will reach that point. So in denying the argument, do you just say flat out there's a fourth premise that you're missing?
That would be one way to understand it. I think that Bostrom's entire argument takes for granted the metaphysical possibility. And for a naturalist like him, I mean, I assume he's a naturalist. Of course he's going to assume that, because he thinks that human beings are the product of naturalistic evolution. So since we're here, he assumes we evolved and we are conscious. Therefore, consciousness must arise out of purely a naturalistic substrate or material substrate. But that's an assumption that certainly you and I and a whole host of non-materialists are going to reject at the outset. So either you could say there's a tacit assumption behind the whole argument, or you could say it's just a different reason, a deeper reason for rejecting the first premise. In other words, we're saying, I don't think we are going to reach the point where it's technically feasible, simply because it's not metaphysically possible. That's a really foundational reason for thinking that it's not technically possible. It's rather like saying, I don't think we'll ever get to the point where we have the technology to create a square circle. I don't think we'll ever get that advanced in our technology to create square circles. To which the answer is, but that has nothing to do with scientific progress, or that there's not enough time in the universe or anything like that. It's just a metaphysical impossibility, geometrical impossibility applied to material objects.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love that. Something I found when I was studying this argument. So Rizvan Verk has a different conception than Bostrom, and Bostrom, as he talks in interviews about his hypothesis or his argument, really, because he's not saying that we do live in one. He says this is just the argument, and premise 3 is that we do live in the simulated world. But he, in responding to a bunch of, he kind of did what you do, and he gets a lot of emails about stuff. So he wrote up a blog post about it. And he says, all positive evidence for living in a simulation hypothesis have to be ruled out because, one, we would expect if someone says, I saw a bunch of pixels in my mirror, well, we would expect schizophrenia and different types of mental disabilities in the base reality and also in the simulated world. So it could just be that you're seeing things just like someone would see things in the base reality. And also, the simulators, if they were this advanced, could just run the simulation back and scrub out any kind of evidence if they didn't want you to know. And so it's kind of funny that Bostrom's argument there rules out positive evidence, which a lot of people on the popular level will cite. They'll say, look at the 2016 election. There's no way Trump was supposed to win, but he won because the simulators wanted to see what would happen if Donald Trump had won instead of Hillary, like she did in the base reality. I hear this all the time from popular intellectuals, Elon Musk and stuff like that. They'll talk about this. So I just want to note that Bostrom rules that out as well. So we have machine functionalism is metaphysically out. Positive evidence ruled out by Bostrom. So you can't really come forward and say, look at the providence that we see in history. Well, no, this doesn't leave room for providence. And then also there's no genuine creation account here. Have you thought about that? I can't remember if you talked about that in your article or not, but it seems like it just kicks the can one step back. We could say, well, who created the simulator creator?
Yeah. What I find fascinating about these simulation scenario proposals and the fact that they're being seriously entertained is that they are basically intelligent design theories, right?
Yeah.
And if anyone was suggesting a theistic intelligent design theory, then of course they're dismissed as a kook, religious.
Yep.
This is just God of the gaps. But now we're allowed the simulators of the gaps, the scientists of the gaps. So there does seem like there's a double standard here. That on the one hand, you're allowed to appeal to some outer reality, some intelligent agent that has designed everything around us. But of course, as you say, that is kicking the can down the road. Now, these simulation hypotheses, they aren't really being offered as an explanation for apparent design in our reality. I don't think anyone's putting them forward. Maybe some are. Maybe they're doing the kind of work as
they're slipping in. They're slipping in. Rizwan Virk and a couple other folks in physics have said this is our theory of everything. This is how we make sense of Einsteinian physics and quantum physics, because in a computer game the what you're not looking at is not rendered. And so when you look somewhere else, it's the collapse of the wave function because it's rendering now, and it's exactly what you said. It's pretty bonkers, but at least it's not God.
Yes, I know. Any designer except God will be acceptable. But the problem is with these scenarios that these designers are themselves finite beings.
Right.
Even in the way that you were describing it earlier, the simulators want to run it a different way to see what happens. Well, that implies that they were limited in their knowledge. They actually had to run a simulation to find out how things were going to go, or they didn't get it right first time, so you got to rewind it and scrub it and so forth. So clearly these simulators that are being postulated, they're very highly advanced, highly intelligent. And yet they're still finite in their intelligence. They're still apparently bound by space and time. They don't have the kind of properties that God has in classical theism. So they are, again, the hypothesis assumes that they themselves are evolved beings, that they evolved from whatever lower life forms and eventually reached a degree of intellectual and technological advancement where they're able to create a simulator. But of course, they themselves are still presumably inhabitants of some kind of universe that has limitations, that is temporal in nature and spatially bound in some way, and that makes them contingent. And so you've still got the problems of explaining why there's any contingent beings at all. You can run some sort of cosmological argument to say that even if we've got simulators within simulators within simulators, at some point this base reality is still a contingent universe that needs a necessary being to explain why it exists in the first place. And you've got presumably some problem of fine-tuning or cosmic order, because you can only create a simulation in a universe that has natural laws that allow you to do it. Presumably it's a finely tuned universe. It may not have the laws and constants that our universe does or appears to have, but there has to be some sort of cosmic order. And again, you need some transcendent explanation for that, I think. Yeah.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And one thing I was thinking about with that is the conversation collapses back down, like you said. So whether we have to traverse a almost infinite of simulations, you still have to get back to base reality and say, well, there's certain conditions that have to obtain in order for this simulation to happen. But likewise, as insofar as this is a consistent universe, the Lord of non-contradiction argument still applies. So if this is governed by logic, and we can still trace logic all the way back into the mind of God, if your argument is sound.
Yeah, that's right. These simulated universes are all physical in nature, or they appear to be physical in nature. So you've got a physical simulation within a physical simulation within a physical simulation. None of this takes into account what we would regard as abstract entities.
Right.
So numbers, propositions, possible worlds, and so forth. If there are such things, then they have to be in the base reality, and they have to, in some sense, transcend all of the simulations themselves. One way we could put it is, if there is a truth of the matter about the simulation hypothesis, then there are truths, and if there are truths, then we can run an argument for God's existence from the existence of truths, rather like the Lord of non-contradiction argument.
I love that. That's so great. So even if you didn't want to quibble over machine functionalism and theories of mind, even if you don't know that, like, just familiarize yourself with Dr. Anderson's Lord of non-contradiction, which is also kind of technical and hard, but this isn't the smokescreen they think it is what I want to tell people out there listening right now. Like, it's just another layer, and it's pretty easy to argue against, though it is interesting. And I think it's interesting because it makes us think, and I think thinking's good. It makes us think about God, and could this possibly be happening? But I think one of the most powerful arguments against the idea that we're living in a computer simulation is the problem of self-defeat. Can you lay out, do you have this on top of your mind that you can lay this out for us?
Sure. I think there are several ways you could run this argument, and I briefly laid out one line of thinking at the end of my blog post that you referred to, and I think you've written something on this that takes us maybe a slightly different approach. Yeah. But what I argued is that and I was thinking mainly of something like Bostrom's simulation hypothesis, where you have some species that has evolved to the point, some species like us that has evolved to the point and become technologically advanced enough to be able to run a simulation. And that whole scenario presupposes a certain amount of scientific knowledge. It presupposes that there are computers, and that computers can become advanced enough to become conscious, or to think, and to host some sort of simulated world with conscious beings like us. So the entire simulation hypothesis, whatever this base reality is, it has the same kind of scientific features in general terms as our reality, because we're conceiving it along those lines. But the problem is that then if we are in fact in a simulation, then all of our scientific knowledge that we have about the laws of physics and the nature of computing devices and whether computers can become conscious, all of that knowledge, all of that all of those concepts are derived from experiences of a virtual world, a fake world. Okay. And so it seems illegitimate to say that all of the concepts and all the scientific knowledge that we've derived from this simulated world can be applied to whatever the base reality is.
Right.
Because this base reality, we're actually conceiving it along the same sort of scientific lines as the world that we actually inhabit. And that does seem to be self-defeating, because on the one hand, you're saying this world that we inhabit is not real, it's simulated, and yet we can use it as a guide to understand some hypothesized real reality.
Yeah.
It's almost it's a little like Wittgenstein's ladder, where you have to climb up the ladder to get on the roof, and then you kick the ladder away from behind you once you've got there. It seems that's that same sort of self-defeating dynamic.
Yeah, I think you're right on that, and that's what got me so excited about that argument. Is that, and I think you do note this in the blog post as well, that not only does Bostrom his argument presuppose this kind of scientific knowledge, but it starts there. It starts, hey, look, everything is exactly like it looks to you, but just fast forward 50 years, and then what would it be like? And so it's explicitly saying, take what you see right now as your starting evidence, but then what you do is you just turn it back on itself and say, well, then we would never get started in the first place. If we get to this conclusion that premise 3 is true, that we're living in a computer simulation, then we actually shouldn't trust the scientific knowledge, the empirical knowledge that we have to get us started. And so it's like the snake biting its tail kind of self-defeat. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, that's right. You have to sort of put yourself in Bostrom's shoes. He's starting with the assumption that human beings are highly evolved animals. Okay, so he's assuming the entire neo-Darwinian, or some variation of the neo-Darwinian evolutionary account of human origins, and saying now imagine that scenario extended forwards to the point where these people or creatures like us have developed these technologies. But the problem is that starting assumption is one that he thinks he knows within, not within the base reality, but within the simulated world. In other words, all of the evidence that he thinks he has for a neo-Darwinian account of human origins is from within a simulation.
Right.
So you can't then assume that that's how things would be in the base reality.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm not sure how different my answer is than yours, but I wanted to also deal with Ries van Werk's simulated video game hypothesis that we are in the Matrix, that we're a brain in a vat. And I thought about Putnam's argument, and I don't really get it, and it might commit us to like semantic externalism in a way that I wouldn't want to be committed to. But what I was thinking was, this is a point that actually Ben Shapiro brought up when he's talking about the Matrix, and he said the Matrix, the directors and the authors, they never addressed the question, is Neo still in the Matrix? Because once he woke up from the Matrix, why should he not believe that he's in a nested matrix? Why would he ever trust anything ever again? And that's what I was trying to get at. And it's a similar point, if not the same point as you, that if our cognitive faculties have been aimed at a lie, the deception that we are living in base reality, then we can never come to know that we're not living in base reality. So you have discovered that all of your cognitive faculties are aimed at a falsity, that you're living in base reality. Once you come to know that, you have a defeater for all of your beliefs, including the belief that you live in a computer simulation. Do you think that works?
Yeah. I do. I think that's a distinct argument from the one that I'm offering, because the one I was using is based on our scientific knowledge. So the hypothesis itself is based on a certain subset of scientific knowledge. Yeah. But once you accept the hypothesis, you then have a defeater for that scientific knowledge. Yeah. You, if I understand your argument correctly, are broadening that out to our entire belief system.
Yeah.
And I think you noted this yourself. I had a look at your paper, which was
nice.
Excellent, by the way.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed reading that. What you're doing is really adapting Plantinger's evolutionary argument against naturalism. So Plantinger is entertaining the hypothesis of evolutionary naturalism. He's saying, so assume evolutionary naturalism is true. In that case, there would be no reason to think that your beliefs are, or that your cognitive faculties are reliably truth directed.
Yeah.
Right. He basically argues it would be inscrutable. The probability that well, actually, I think his argument now is that it would be low. I think he's ditched the inscrutable aspect now. It's a very low probability that your cognitive faculties would be geared towards truth, and therefore that most of your beliefs would be true. In which case, you now have a defeater for your belief in evolutionary naturalism.
Right.
What you are doing is instead of considering evolutionary naturalism, you're considering the simulation hypothesis, where our cognitive faculties are not, in fact, the product of blind evolutionary processes, but rather the product of some super beings, the simulators, whoever they are benevolent or not so benevolent architects,
right,
of this matrix. Mm-hmm. And your argument is that on that hypothesis, our cognitive faculties are the product of design, but malevolent design.
Right.
Because we've been given an entire set of experiences and intuitions as well, because it's not just our experiences, but we have this intuition that the world is real, that that our cognitive faculties are in fact reliable, but all of these intuitions are misguided. They've been we've been given this full panoply of false beliefs, and therefore we have a defeater for any argument or reasons we might have for holding the simulation hypothesis in the first place. Is that right? I think that's what you're arguing.
That is right, and part of that is because one of my friends studies epistemology at Northwestern, and he kept poking at me on this idea, because I love self-defeating arguments. I love it, and he loves probabilities and Bayesian reasoning. So we go back and forth, and he's my superior, of course. But he brought up Chalmers' argument. And Chalmers is Chalmers is goofy all over the place. I love him, but he's very goofy. And he's like, well, what if it turns out that the stuff that the reality is made up of, is not quarks, but little digital things, and it turns out it would still be a desk. This desk that I'm touching right now would still be a desk. And so I wanted to get past that argument. He does this, I call it a qua move because I'm a theology student, but he says, Neo, qua the Matrix, thought that he was in Manhattan or wherever he was in an office building. And that was true qua the Matrix, even though qua the real world, he's in New Jersey maybe, and he's, a brain in a vat or a full body in a vat. And so he's doing this qua move and saying that we can be justified in this paper called Matrix as Metaphysics. So I wanted to undercut that and everything and just say, as long as someone designed our cognitive faculties to be aimed at a lie, and the lie is that you live in base reality. The rest could be no problem, but you think in the intuitions, your cognitive faculties tell you this, whether base reality is digital or not. If you're not living in base reality, I don't think you can come to know that you're not, because then your whole process, it's all self-defeating. And so then I don't know that it's self-refuting. So even if it is possible that we are living in computer simulation, you would be unjustified in believing that, because it's self-defeating, not self-refuting. Do you make that sharp distinction between the two?
I understand the distinction that a self-refuting proposition is one that is false if it's true. So there's a direct contradiction. Right. Whereas a self-defeating argument is one that sort of cuts out the rational support from under itself. Yeah. I think that the matrix hypothesis is self-defeating in that respect, insofar as the moment you come to believe that you are in the matrix, you do seem to thereby acquire a defeater for really everything that you believe, including whatever reasons led you to the thought or the conclusion that you are in the matrix. And I think the point you made earlier, I think you attributed it to Ben Shapiro, is that once you're out of the matrix, there's a sense in which your trust in your senses has been permanently undermined.
Exactly. Yeah.
And certainly going back into the matrix, it's never the same, because you're always going to see it as illusory and virtual, whereas you previously understood it to be the plain veridical reality. But even once you're outside of it, there are questions raised about whether all you've done is ascended one level up the simulation, and you haven't hit base. Why would you ever have grounds then to think that you had hit base reality, or that any of your reasoning ever made contact with that base reality? Not so much your experiences, because you could always think, well, I'm just in the next I've just gone up a level or down a level, depending on how you order them. But the point is that you think that you can actually reason your way to some truths about the base reality, even if you're not experiencing. You have to to escape this skepticism, you have to trust that you're able to reason your way to truths about the base reality. And I don't see how you could do that. You're caught up in this morass of skepticism, not just about your experiences, but all of your intuitions and reasoning processes.
Yeah. And this is something that, so the Matrix, the folks who wrote the Matrix were pulling from Philip K. Dick, and it's kind of a whole homage to him, because he's one of the first in this. Well, maybe not one of the first, but he famously said we're living in a computer simulation in like 1977. But what Dick would always do is he would leave you in this foggy haze. Are you really in real reality? And that was like this cliffhanger, and always mess with you. And with the Matrix authors, they just dropped the ball on this. In one of the movies, he stops a squiddy robot thing in base reality, and you're like left thinking, are you not? And they should have ran with that some more, but they didn't. Maybe they will in the new one. But I always felt so bad once I considered your argument and thought about this more. I feel so bad about Neo, because he can just never be justified ever again.
Right.
He's got a defeater for everything. It's like that poor guy.
Yeah. How can you live like that? You'd have to, you'd have to do what David Hume did. Just go play some backgammon and try to forget it all, forget how you reasoned yourself into this skeptical mess. Yeah. Although speaking of movies and how in the Matrix, as you say, I don't know if it was I think it was the second one, where they started messing with whether the base reality really was the base reality. And as you say, they didn't run with that. One thing I loved about the movie Inception is it really did introduce that ambiguity. And I won't give away any spoilers, although if people haven't seen it by now, they really ought to have. But it does leave a very open question at the end about where base reality really is.
Yeah, and that's they were more faithful to Descartes' dream argument, and I think that's part of it too. When you're in it, you think that you're. I had a crazy dream last night where I had to memorize. I was talking with Taylor Sear, actually, philosopher of free will, and it was weird, but I had to memorize something, and I woke up memorizing it, and I was like, that felt like so dreams are crazy. But Dr. Anderson, so one of my friends has said, well, our reasoning is a priori. Like, he's much smarter than me, so he would say it in a different way than that. But can it be that our reasoning can be, our rational faculties that they're a priori, so we can trust them in a way that would help us transcend the problem of finding out that we're in a computer simulation? Or do you, because I don't see it. I think that I think the self-defeat argument works, but is there anything there? I'm doing a terrible job presenting it, and I should have asked him before this. Can you see any reason why someone could evade this by saying, no, our reasoning's a priori, no matter what level of reality we're we're in, we're still reasoning the same, just put in a different situation. Maybe if you're more inclined towards internalism.
Yeah, that's a good question. Descartes, of course, argued that even if your experiences were illusory, you could still know that you exist, because that's a indubitable a priori item of knowledge. And maybe there are other items like mathematical truths, the laws of logic, and so forth, that we just know, even if we can't trust our senses.
Right.
And I think that there's something to that, in that our a priori reason does have a kind of undeniability to it that our sensory experiences do not.
Right.
But I don't think it therefore follows that that skeptical questions couldn't be raised about a priori beliefs as well.
Yeah.
To circle back to Plantinga's argument from the evolutionary argument against naturalism, I don't think that one could appeal to a priori reason to escape that and say, well, maybe it's just our maybe it's just our sensory, our perceptual beliefs that are undermined by that. But really, it's an argument about whether any of our cognitive faculties, including our intuitions, including our rational intuitions, are trustworthy. Now, certainly it's the case that we can't help but trust them, but it doesn't mean that we couldn't work ourselves into a skeptical scenario where we start to doubt them or raise serious questions about their trustworthiness. So yeah, you might be able to defend your beliefs as being internally justified, but whether they have external rationality and whether they really are true, that's a separate question, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's great, and the intuition language is huge. I hadn't used that before, but I really like that. I'm gonna adjust my argument there, because even your rational intuitions, especially that you're living in base reality, have been aimed at a falsehood. Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you. So I want to transition now to the authorial analogy, which is another line of reasoning, and there's arguments in there which have really been influential to me, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, since Calvinism and the Problem of Evil came out, which is, I think, maybe 2016. Your paper in here is called Calvinism and the First Sin, and at this time I think I was reading a lot of John Frame, and I think I saw Wayne Grudem. There's a few theologians who, C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers, who talk about the God-world relation as analogous to an author and his or her story. And so I love this analogy. I think it's the truth too. I don't think it's just a intuition pump. I think we're literally living in a theodrama or some sort of novel, an analogous novel. But some theologians today will use the simulation hypothesis and say, well, if we make that into a metaphor for the God-world relation, then it can help people, see how they can be reasonable. They can have rational beliefs about God's providence and such. And for me, I don't think I think metaphors are literally false anyways. So I like analogies over metaphors, but I don't think the simulation hypothesis rightly picks out the attributes of God in the same way that the authorial analogy does, because God creates with words. So anyways, let's get on to the authorial analogy. How do you think of this? How did you come to this line of thought that God's like an author?
Well, the first time I started writing about this was in that article that you mentioned in Calvinism and the Problem of Evil, where I was invited to write specifically on Calvinism and the first sin, and how we can, well, the question of the first sin raises a number of theological challenges for Calvinism, and one would be the charge that God is the author of sin. If we accept some sort of comprehensive divine determinism. Most would say that Calvinism commits you to some version of divine determinism, where God is the ultimate determiner of all things. That would include the first sin as well as every other sin, and that seems to make God the author of evil. It implies that God is culpable for the sins of his creatures and so forth. And I started thinking about what are some ways to answer these challenges. And it seemed to me that a lot of it had to do with how you conceived of causation, divine causation. Mm-hmm. So if we're saying, along with the great Reformed confessions, that God is the first cause of all things, but God works through second causes, how do we understand the connection between God as first cause and then the secondary causes, including human free choices? Mm. And it seemed to me that when people object to the idea that God is the first cause of all things and is causally determining all things, then they're thinking as though God is one cause on the same level as every other cause. So there's sort of this matrix of univocal causes, mm-hmm. And God starts the causal chain going. So God causes one thing, which causes another thing, which causes another thing, and eventually at the end of the cause, Adam sins, or
do you call this do you call this the domino theory? I think one of the authors did.
Yeah, no, that was me. I said a lot of people think about this in terms of what I call the domino model, on analogy with a line of dominoes. You see these people who, the videos of people who lay out millions of dominoes all in a big chain, and you just knock over the first one, it knocks over the second one, and so you've got a chain of causation. And I think some people think that God as first cause is like the guy who knocks over the first domino and then knocks the second, knocks the third, and you can obviously trace back responsibility. So the 100th domino falls because the 99th one did, and so forth, but ultimately it's the guy who flicked the first domino who has to take responsibility for all the other dominoes. And people think of divine causes in that way, that if I cause an evil act, then there's a chain of like causes that go back and ultimately terminate with God. Mm-hmm. And the culpability, if this is a sinful action, then the culpability for that action has to be traced back along the chain of causes to God, and the causal buck stops with God, you might say. And what I argue in that paper is that I think the domino model, among its many deficiencies, fails to recognize the creator-creature distinction, mm-hmm. and that God's causes are operating on a different ontological level than the creation. So what I argue is that we need to distinguish intramundane causes, that is, causes within the creation, and that would include natural causes like a tree falling down and crushing a plant or something like that, and also creaturely free causes. However you understand creaturely agent causes, we would be in that matrix of intramundane causes. I'm aware when I use the word matrix now, given our earlier discussion, not matrix in that sense, matrix just as a network of causes. So there are intramundane causes within the creation, but God's causation operates at a different level and a different way, and so it's a mistake to trace culpability through intramundane causes back through divine causes to God. And so I suggest that a better way to think of God's causation is on analogy with the author of a novel, where you distinguish between the characters within the novel and the interactions that they have. So there's the level of the story itself, but then there's the level of the author's relationship to the story. So I use the example of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. So Tolkien creates this imaginary world of Middle Earth, and he has Gollum do something to Frodo. right? So Gollum does something to Frodo, and there's that causation within the level of the story itself. Now we can ask the question: did Tolkien make Gollum do that? Well, in a sense, he did, but not on the same level as a character within the story. If say Gandalf had come along and Gandalf made Gollum do something to Frodo, that's a different relationship than Tolkien as the author making these things happen. Now, of course, it is an analogy, so there are points of difference that we can draw out between our understanding of an author and a story in our experience and God's relationship to his creation. But nonetheless, what that authorial model does at least is it brings out more clearly that divine causes are operating at a different level than causes within the creation. Yeah. And so to just trace back culpability to God in that direct way, I think is overlooking that pretty fundamental metaphysical point, namely the creator-creature distinction.
Yeah, that was so helpful, and I always use Tolkien now because of your article, and I just see talking with Christians, I talk about this, and their eyes light up because everyone gets Lord of the Rings. You're Christian, you've seen the movies, you read the books, and I like talking about Smeagol killing his cousin Deagle. And I say, well, who's responsible for that? And well, in a sense, yes, it's Tolkien, like you said, but within the story, or intra-narratively, another great word that you've used, it's Smeagol. He's responsible. And so, yes, Tolkien is responsible, but not in the same manner. If you were to go arrest Tolkien and say you're responsible for Deagle's death, that would be silly. Everyone would laugh at you. That wouldn't be taken seriously because it's two different levels of reality going on.
Right.
And so I love that model. I love that. It's two different levels. And I think you end up saying, if God is morally responsible for the evil that happens in his story, it's in a thin sense, or he's not morally, if he's the author of sin, it's not in a morally culpable way. Is that right?
Right. Well, we can say that he's not culpable simply in virtue of causing it as the author of creation. Just the mere fact that God is the first cause, and I argue the ultimate sufficient cause of everything that takes place in his creation, that mere fact alone doesn't make him culpable. But then there's also the subsequent question of intentions, which need to be brought out as well. So to again go back to the Tolkien example, so bad things happen in Tolkien's books. People do bad things, they do evil things. Is Tolkien approving of those? Is he commending those? No, because they're part of a larger narrative, which I think we would argue has a profoundly moral point to it. It's in a sense, it's we're applying a sort of greater good theodicy to the bad things that happen in Middle Earth. Tolkien has a greater good. There's a moral message that's being communicated, and there's a sense in which actually these evil things have to happen in order for that good message to be communicated. And so we can apply, again, it's an analogy, but I think it's a respectable one, that God, as it were, writes these evil events, and the supreme example, of course, is the crucifixion of Christ itself. That's the paradigmatic case within which every other evil has to be judged. But that he writes that into the story because he has perfectly good and holy intentions for the outcome of the story.
Yeah, I love the authorial analogy, and I wrote my master's thesis on this. I wanted to write on God and time because C.S. Lewis talks a little bit about this. How when an author is writing the story and it gets to the plot, the climax, but then the author goes to take a drink of coffee, the characters intranarratively, they're not frozen in time waiting for the author to come back. And I like that relation between God and reality. And Dr. Van Hooser goes, yeah, but the problem of evil is right there. So he made me do it on the problem of evil instead. And something that initially people, when they don't like the analogy, they'll always push back and say, yeah, but Smeagol isn't real. Smeagol isn't real. And it wasn't until I saw a mutual acquaintance or friend, Paul Manata on Facebook, said he gave this genie case. And he says, well, imagine you find a genie and you wish that Lord of the Rings, that Middle Earth were true, that it were real, that there was a pocket universe or something. Would that all of a sudden make the story bad? Would it automatically be a bad story if Samwise were a real person? And like you said, no, it still seems like there's a greater good. It still seems like it's a good story, even if the characters are real in the same sense. My friend Paul Maxwell has made the point that, yeah, it's not real. He's brought that argument up as well. And we're going to talk about that on the podcast. So stay tuned, listeners, for that. But so then I had to face a bunch of objections to this. And one that was raised actually because of your simulation hypothesis argument. It was raised for myself as I was reading philosophy of mind stuff. And I thought, could the self-defeat argument apply to the authorial analogy? And a lot of people have tried to apply this to determinism, and I'm a theological determinist. So my view of the authorial analogy is going to be deterministic. Some Arminians use it, but I don't think they use it consistently, because I think this is a theological deterministic model. So if the reasons for your belief are ultimately God's reasons, God wrote the story and he caused you to have these beliefs, then you wouldn't be justified in these beliefs. But furthermore, any actions that you perform based on these beliefs, the culpability, I think, would collapse all the way back down to God. And so that was part of my thesis, was refuting that claim. And you've already talked about it, and you talked about it in your essay as well, that I keep saying add. So intranarratively, the characters have reasons for their beliefs, and a good author will give them reasons for their beliefs. A bad author will just, ex machina, deus ex machina, drop in a belief into your head that doesn't make sense with there's no historical conditions for your beliefs and your freedom. But God's the perfect author. And so he authors in such a way that even though you are theologically determined, you have reasons for the beliefs that you have, and they're your reasons and they're good reasons. And so I don't think there's any self-defeat there, even though they love to charge that again and again and again.
Yeah. Again, what the authorial model does is it reminds us to avoid these level confusions.
Yes.
Where in the intranarratival level, all of the characters, as well as having causes that are acting on them within that world, they also have reasons for their actions, and their reasons can be entirely genuine ones. Of course, they can have some false beliefs, they're going to make some fallacious inferences, of course, but the fact that there is an author of that story doesn't change that at all. So I can have perfectly good reasons for doing what I do. And it can also be the case that God ordained, to use the theological language, or authored, to use the an analogical language, authored that I would have those reasons. But the fact that God is the author of me having those reasons, of course, is entirely compatible with me having those reasons. In fact, it entails it. So, if God ordains that I have good reasons for doing what I do, then I do have good reasons for doing what I do. And I think as well, the determinism on this issue is a bit of a red herring, because everything that we've been saying, a Molinist could say as well, insofar as Molinism is committed to meticulous divine providence as well. Okay, the way that God accomplishes that is different. But on the Molinist view, you have libertarian free will, so there's no causal determinism, but there is a weaker kind of determinism insofar as God sovereignly decrees that a certain feasible world will be actualized, and that decree is efficacious. So even on a Molinist model, God is in a sense the author of everything. There is a comprehensive divine decree. God is the author of the entirety of human history, but that tries to accommodate an indeterministic view of free will. But if there is an objection to the authorial model, then it would apply to both Calvinism and Molinism equally, which shows that the question of determinism is actually irrelevant.
Yeah. I selfishly want to kick out the Molinists off of the authorial analogy, but you're right in that aspect. If the determinism is the problem, what I found helpful is a theory in free will called reason's responsiveness, or guidance control, which has reason's responsiveness and mechanism control. And so you can be determined by, but you're determined by reasons and responding to them. So Tolkien has determined that Smeagol will turn into Gollum, but he has his own reasons for doing that. He hated his cousin. He wanted to steal the ring, and they were his reasons, and they weren't overridden. There was no microchip going in there. It wasn't going against his character. And so by having the characters respond with reasons, respond to reasons, they can still be morally culpable for the actions that they take on those reasons while still being determined to do so. But furthermore, this is something that Dr. Van Hooser does in his book. I'm drawing a blank on it right now. I spent like a whole year reading this book. I'll tell it later when I remember. But he talks about two different ways of authorship. One is monological, one voice, and one is dialogical, two voices. And I think that the analogy can be stretched even further if you view God's relation to the world as a dialogical author, that we live in a dialogue, not a monologue. And so how does God determine that we do stuff? Well, he gives us reasons, and he's a character, he's the main character of the story. Mm-hmm. And so he's presenting different reasons to us, and he's going through our minds. He's not overriding our minds when he does this. Even in divine illumination, or in bringing us to faith, regenerating us, he opens our eyes and he persuades us and he illumines us. He doesn't force us. He doesn't drop in ideas into our mind that don't make sense in our causal history. And so I love it. So I wanted to thank you for that, because you used this as a way to think about the first sin, but it opened my eyes to a full God-world relation that I think is literally true, even if God is not univocally an author in the same way that Tolkien is. But it's an analogy, and so analogies can give us literal truths, even though it's not in a univocal sense. And you just read Genesis 1 or John 3 or Psalm 33, I think. God creates by his word, just like an author does. Tolkien started writing and Middle-earth was. But of course, he's a sub-author, and he's not creating ex nihilo the way God is.
Yeah, let me throw out something else then into the mix, because I've been thinking about this a little more in anticipation of our conversation.
Yeah.
And when we say that the authorial model is an analogy, we could mean that in the weak sense that it's just a way of thinking, a helpful way of thinking about it. It's a conceptual tool, kind of like when you're teaching biology, and you say that the cell is like a factory. So you use the analogy of a factory. The cell's got different parts in it, and it's like a factory. But we're not saying that there's some, as it were, deep metaphysical relationship between a cell and a factory. It's just a mental tool for thinking about it. And you could treat the authorial model in that way. But I wonder if, in fact, we shouldn't treat it as something deeper, as getting at an analogical metaphysical relationship between God's authorship of creation and our authorship of stories. And let me give you a couple of, well, maybe just one parallel. So we think of the relationship between the Father and the Son within the Trinity. So we've got a father-son relationship, and we say that is analogical to the human father-son relationship. Now, we're not just saying that's a helpful way of thinking about it. We're not simply saying, God the Father's relationship to God the Son is, if you think of it, it's kind of like a father's-son relationship. We're saying something deeper than that. We're saying that's the archetypal father-son relationship, and that our human father-son relationships, that parental relationship, while there are differences, that is an ectypal reflection of that original relationship between the Father and the Son. So there's something. It's a created analogy of that relationship between the first and second persons of the Trinity. Now, we could say something similar about our ability to author stories. Mm-hmm. That is, when we say that Tolkien is the author of the story, that capacity that Tolkien has to author a story is actually just the finite version of God's works of creation and providence. Yeah. That is to say that God's works of creation and providence are the archetypal authorship activity. Yeah. It's not just a way of thinking, but actually our ability to author stories and almost, as it were, to create ex nihilo. I mean, we don't obviously literally create ex nihilo in the way that God does, but when I come up with an idea or a story and I create characters, there's a sense in which I'm bringing something into existence out of nothing at that story level, at that narratival level. What if that is just the archetypal reflection of God's original authorship of the creation? And I think that adds a kind of depth to the authorial model that you don't get simply if you're treating it like a helpful way of thinking about it. I think there's something deeper going on there.
I think you're absolutely right, and that's the main point I made in my thesis. I was defending against the problem of evil because I think I think the authorial model analogy is the way reality is. So I wanted to defend it, to bolster it, and show that not only can it be defended against evil, it actually can give a positive answer against evil. And you alluded to already a greater good theodicy. It's a narratival greater good theodicy, and it's based on God revealing Himself more fully in the cross. And so, why is there evil in the world? Well, because it's part of the story, and without evil, without Satan's temptation and the fall, you don't have the fullest revelation of Christ. You don't see God's nature as redeemer and just and justifier, and so there's a fuller revelation because of that. But the story necessitates it. But then, furthermore, like you said, it's not a Feuerbachian projection. It's not an anthropomorphism to call God an author. He's the original author, just like you said. Right. He created with words. In the beginning, He spoke, and it was. Psalm, I think it's 33, calls Him like a star breather. Because of His word went out. And just like you said, yeah, we create with words as well. And this is something that distinguishes us from the animals as well. They're not creating. They're not sub-creators, as Tolkien says. They don't use words in the same way. So I do think there's something deep here, and I would love to see it catch on. And that's part of the reason I also want to take shots at the simulation hypothesis, because I think the simulation hypothesis can be kind of an intuition pump. I don't think it's a very good one, thinking about the divine world relation, especially when we have the authorial analogy here. Maybe if you were a process theologian or some sort of process Molinist, maybe, that God is using simulation hypothesis or simulated worlds to gain that middle knowledge or something. Oh, okay, you guys can have that, I guess. But so I just wanted to further thank you that even through your blog posts that you're saying I'm just dumping these out there. There's lots of us out here who have been really encouraged by those, and we've been mulling on them for a while. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot more people start using simulation hypothesis in their theology papers. I hope they don't. I hope they hear this and they instead turn to authorial analogy. But it's been so helpful for me. So thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So the book, it was Remythologizing Theology by Dr. Van Hooser. I recommend everyone check that out. And then this book, Calvinism and the Problem of Evil, is what we've been mentioning again and again. And that's edited by David Alexander and Daniel Johnson. This is an awesome book. I've read this a few times and I reference it in many of my papers. I definitely recommend Calvinist, Arminian, whatever, read that book. And then I have to plug this one as well. Dr. Anderson's dissertation turned book, Paradox in Christian Theology. And Paul Helm talked about somewhere in here about how it kind of snuck through. Maybe it was in a review.
It was on his blog, actually. Okay. Yeah, Helm's Deep. He wrote a very generous, kind review of it, saying, it sort of snuck out and no one noticed it. But I think it has been picked up on. it's very gratifying when I see it cited in some other work.
Well, and that's why I want to bring it up as well, because it's taken, maybe it didn't explode like it should have, but it has been picked up. I talked with Oliver Chris the other day on the podcast, and we mentioned it, and I saw you tweeted today maybe that the new contradictory Christ deals with it. So again, a really important work, and for any budding theologians and philosophers out there who think about Christian theology, you got to read this book, Paradox in Christian Theology, an analysis of its presence, character, and epistemic status. So, Dr. Anderson, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I would love to be able to entice you on again. I hope that you come back on. We could talk some more deep stuff. Really excited. I think you're going on Capturing Christianity soon as well.
I've been invited. I guess we got to work out some details.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. So look for that, folks at home. Dr. Anderson, so where can people find you if they want to hear more of your stuff, read more of your stuff?
Really, the best place to go would be my website that we mentioned earlier. So www.proginosko.com, proginosko.com, or if you use your favorite search engine to look up Analogical Thoughts. That's the title of the blog, Analogical Thoughts. And that's sort of a one-stop shop for everything James Anderson related. You can find links to some of my published work and some summaries of my books, and then there's just a lot of random thoughts of varying quality that have been put into blog posts over the last, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so.
Yeah, well, they're awesome. There's a lot on Molinism, a lot on all sorts of stuff on there. So go check that out. And also, I have an earlier episode with Dr. Anderson where we talk about transcendental arguments, and we get into all sorts of random metaphysics as well. So check that one out as well. We could talk about this some more, and Lord willing, someday we will. But for now, this is going to have to do it. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.